Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're totally mastering the mechanics of cellular respiration. And we're not just going to sit here and read textbook facts. We are actually going to tackle a real SPM biology question head-on by truly understanding the underlying concepts. So whether you're gearing up for an exam or you're just genuinely fascinated by how our bodies generate the energy to survive, you are definitely in the right place. Let's get into it. Okay, let's jump right into this trial question from the Teranganu paper. Question 9 simply asks, which process of respiration produces carbon dioxide? And we're given three options. Option A is lactic acid fermentation in bacteria. Option B is lactic acid fermentation in yeast. And option C is alcohol fermentation in yeast. Now, to someone who hasn't reviewed their metabolic pathways, these might literally all look like confusing variations of the exact same thing. But I promise you, by the end of this explainer, the answer is going to be incredibly obvious. We just need to figure out which exact process produces carbon dioxide. To solve this mystery, we really need to zoom out and look at the big picture first. Like, how do our cells actually extract energy from glucose in the first place? And crucially, what are the different branching pathways that cells are forced to take when oxygen is either running low or just entirely missing? This right here is the fundamental fork in the road for cellular biology. All right, the core concept we're dealing with is cellular respiration. Simply put, this is the process where living cells break down a main substrate, which is almost always glucose that we get from the food we eat or that plants make during photosynthesis. The whole goal is to generate our cellular energy currency. We call this currency ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, and it's absolutely crucial. Without it, things like protein synthesis or muscle contraction, they simply cannot happen. So let's break down how this energy actually builds up. Cellular respiration always kicks off with a universal first step called glycolysis. Glycolysis basically means the breakdown of glucose, and it happens right out in the cytoplasm of the cell. One glucose molecule gets broken down into two molecules of pyruvate. Now what happens next? Well, that depends entirely on oxygen. If oxygen is present, that pyruvate moves into the mitochondrion, where it goes through a series of oxidations, pumping out ATP, water, and carbon dioxide. When your cells have plenty of oxygen available, they perform what we call aerobic respiration. This is the ideal, best-case scenario. It is a complete breakdown of glucose. Because it's a complete oxidation, the glucose is totally dismantled, leaving us with just carbon dioxide and water as byproducts, alongside a massive amount of chemical energy. Notice the locations here too. It starts out in the cytoplasm with glycolysis, but the real heavy lifting of oxidation gets finished inside the mitochondrion. Now, what's truly staggering is the energy payout here. From just one single, microscopic glucose molecule undergoing complete oxidation, the cell generates exactly 2,898 kilojoules of energy. That is incredibly efficient. It provides way more than enough ATP to power our complex daily activities. But, conditions aren't always perfect. If oxygen is limited, like in your muscles when you're going all out on a heavy sprint, or if it's totally absent, the cell has to pivot to an alternative pathway called fermentation. Fermentation is the incomplete breakdown of glucose. And here is a super vital distinction. Unlike aerobic respiration, fermentation happens solely in the cytoplasm. The mitochondrion is not involved at all. Depending on the organism, fermentation branches into two distinct textbook types. First up, we have alcohol fermentation, which you'll find in yeast, as well as in certain plants, like paddy plants that have adapted to survive in waterlogged, oxygen-poor mud. Then we have lactic acid fermentation. This is the pathway used by bacteria like lactobacillus. Yep, the same stuff that gives us yogurt, and by our very own human muscle cells when they hit an oxygen debt during vigorous training. So here is the crucial distinction, and honestly, the absolute key to solving our SPM question. It's all about the byproducts. Alcohol fermentation breaks glucose down into ethanol and carbon dioxide. In fact, that released carbon dioxide is exactly what makes bread dough puff up and rise when we bake with yeast. On the other hand, lactic acid fermentation strictly produces lactic acid, period. Zero carbon dioxide is released in the lactic acid pathway. And wow, this brilliantly illustrates the drastic drop in energy production when cells are forced to use fermentation. Because fermentation is just an incomplete breakdown of glucose, the energy yield is a tiny fraction of what it could be. Alcohol fermentation yields only 210 kilojoules, and lactic acid fermentation gives a mere 150 kilojoules. Just compare that 150 to the towering 2898 kilojoules from aerobic respiration. I mean, it's a massive, massive difference. Let's quickly put these textbook criteria side by side to really lock it in your memory. Aerobic respiration requires oxygen, uses both the cytoplasm and mitochondrion, produces water, fully oxidizes the glucose, and yields huge energy. Fermentation needs no oxygen, happens entirely in the cytoplasm, doesn't produce water, only incompletely oxidizes glucose, and gives a severely low energy yield. Seeing it structured this way makes the contrast totally undeniable. So armed with all that structured knowledge, let's look back at our Taranganu trial question. It asked, which process produces carbon dioxide? Well, option A and B both suggest lactic acid fermentation. But we now know as a hard biological fact that lactic acid fermentation produces only lactic acid. Actually, scratch those entirely. We can confidently eliminate them, which easily makes option C, alcohol fermentation in yeast, the only correct answer, because it produces both ethanol and carbon dioxide. What you should really take away from this explainer is just how much power oxygen has over the cell. The presence or absence of oxygen strictly dictates the chemical pathway your cells take. It dictates the byproducts, whether you get clean water and CO2 or toxic ethanol or cramp-inducing lactic acid. And it completely dictates the exact energy yield. It literally acts as the ultimate switch on the biological train track.
Before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a fascinating biological puzzle to think about. We know that when we exercise really hard, our muscle cells switch to lactic acid fermentation, right? And that buildup of lactic acid causes painful cramps and intense fatigue. So if this is a universal human biological response, how exactly do elite high-performance sprinters adapt their physiology to survive and push through that extreme oxygen debt? Think about how intense training might actually alter cellular efficiency. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and I'll see you in the next explainer.